Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's webinar about the top NCRs issued during ISO 27001 audits. My name's Amy Wayne. I'm a part of the marketing team at PJR. And I'm just going to be sitting in on today's webinar, facilitating, helping with the question and answer portion of the session, and just, general technical support. So just before we get started and before I hand things over to John, we've got some housekeeping. All participants on the call have been muted just to make sure sound quality is as best as it can be. And the number one question we get about our webinars is, will the slides be available? Can I review the recording? Yes, the slides will be available to download shortly after completion of the webinar from pjr.com. Under the training tab on the top taskbar, you'll be able to select past webinar slides, and you just fill out a little bit of info and you should be available to download them. The recording of the session will be available on our YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. We upload all of our webinar recordings as well as informational videos, promotional videos, and general announcements on a regular basis. Just go to YouTube and search for Perry Johnson Registrars, and you should be able to find our channel fairly easily. If not, there is a link to our channel at the top of our homepage on our website, again, pjr.com. So with all of that taken care of, I do want to take all your questions, and John would love to answer them. So if you do have questions, please feel free to go ahead and type them into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. You can drop them in at any point during the webinar. You don't have to wait until the end. And once we get to the end of the prepared slides, we'll go ahead and read them off, and John will answer them to the best of his ability. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to John. He's our Information Security Technical Manager here at PGR, and he'll be taking you through his presentation today. So go ahead and take it away, John.
Thank you very much, Amy. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Basically, today's presentation, it's again covering some of the most common NCRs that I encounter when I'm performing ISO 27001 audits. And the objective for this presentation are basically for me to impart the knowledge I've gained from my 5 years of being a certified ISO 27001 lead auditor, as well as the program manager for Perry Johnson, and to share some common pitfalls that I've seen companies encounter during my auditing experience. For you all, I hope that you can gain knowledge from the experiences other organizations have gone through during their audits, and ideally you'll be able to develop strategies to have more successful audits and more effective information security management systems. And then, as Amy mentioned, again, at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have as well as I can. All right, so let's jump into it. So for the first slide here, I decided to single out the risk assessment process kind of as a whole, because I see a number of NCRs that I frequently write against this section of the standard. So the first one that I wanted to call out was that the risk assessment process does not define an acceptable level of risk. And I typically see this resulting for a couple of different reasons. Number one is just organizations don't realize that they must clearly define this acceptable level of risk. Clause 612A1 does call that out. Or organizations are hesitant to put a level of risk set in stone as acceptable. I have many clients say, well, you know, a similar risk on, let's say, one system might be a much higher risk to the company than a similar risk on another because of the types of information that those systems handle, sensitivity of the data on those systems, etc. And from my point of view, I think the more effective way is to not have a sliding scale on your acceptable level of risk, but to change the way you evaluate risk so you can have those factors included in how you calculate your risk score. So if you're not looking at the sensitivity of information as part of your equation for calculating risk, you could add that in. And now you have a level playing field. You still have the same acceptable level of risk, but you're able to use factors that are more relevant to your organization in order to determine a more accurate level of risk. But again, it is certainly required that you do define what the acceptable level of risk is, and the expectation as an auditor is that when we go through your risk assessment, if we see risks that have exceeded that acceptable level, there would be treatment plans put in place in order to bring it down beneath the acceptable level of risk. The next issue I see in terms of the risk assessment process is they're not being conducted at planned intervals or when changes are made. And typically, I will see organizations do a great job with the initial assessment. It'll be very thorough, especially during the initial implementation. I feel like it's really in focus. Obviously, it's a cornerstone of the management system. So typically, a thorough initial assessment will be done. But what I'll come across is in surveillance years 2 and recertification years. As the system's been in place for 2 or 3 years, that risk assessment hasn't been touched since the initial implementation. And even if major changes haven't taken place, the expectation is still that those are being revisited to verify that they're still valid and that those risks haven't changed. Other things I've encountered is, and this is quite common, an organization has decided to migrate some of what it does to the cloud, or they're now going to be utilizing a cloud-based offering for a major part of what the organization handles and the information it handles. That absolutely is an occasion that you should be performing a risk assessment according to your process to identify those new threats that may be there due to a major change in your systems like that. So those are both common situations I've encountered where the requirements of the standard weren't being met. Next up, I think this one kind of might just get lost in all the requirements of the clause because it's a pretty lengthy section, but it does call out in clause 612C2 that risk owners be identified for each risk. I don't have a good feel for exactly why this gets missed frequently, but I can say that it does. There's just no identification of risk owners. You'll have a beautiful, registry of risks and threats and mitigations and risk levels, but there's been no risk owner identified. And obviously, the risk owner should be somebody who, has enough knowledge about the asset and the risk that they can make a good decision on whether or not the risk treatment that's been proposed is acceptable. And they should also have the authority to make sure that they can get that risk treatment implemented. And then lastly, in terms of the risk assessment process, again, there's a requirement that the risk be prioritized for treatment. 612E2 does call that out, but oftentimes I won't see any clear indication of the priority in which risks are going to be treated. So the intent here of the standard is that if you have a number of risks that exceed your acceptable level of risk, you would still want to prioritize them in terms of ideally being able to mitigate the highest levels of risk first. Because in reality, you can't always implement every treatment program all at once. There's resource constraints. So the idea is that you're taking care of your biggest risks ahead of lesser risks. All right. Moving on to access control. So this is a section in Annex A. There's a set of controls, obviously, regarding how systems are accessed, how user privilege is assigned, things of that nature. And I do see a frequent amount of findings against this particular section of the Annex A controls. The first one I'd call out is A.9.2.2. That's user access provisioning. Okay, so the standard states that it's required for a formal process to be in place to add or remove access rights. And on many occasions, I've seen user accounts with privileges that had not gone through a formal process. Typically, you'd want to see some type of system that's going to have records of these requests and approvals as well. Could be a ticketing system, it could be a form, it could be, it could be in a specific email exchange to certain members of the administrative staff. I don't presuppose what the process is, but it needs to exist. And what I come across is typically we'll look at a sampling of user accounts, either in your domain or whatever system you may use, and we'll take a look at what permissions they have, and then we'll walk that back, and we'll want to see where's the ticket or the email trail or the form that shows when those permissions were requested and who they were approved by. So I've seen on many occasions permissions for users that couldn't really be explained. In a lot of cases during the audit, you know, I've had the folks I'm working with say, well, they're not supposed to have access to that. I'm not sure why that's like that. So it's really important that you have a really tightly controlled process about how those permissions are being doled out. The next issue I see in this section frequently is in regards to the review of user access rights. That's 8.9.2.5. So the standard says it's required that user access rights are reviewed at regular intervals. And again, this is one that, in my experience and opinion, I think a lot of organizations, especially larger organizations, I guess feel it's too overwhelming. You know, I'm not sure exactly why they haven't done it, but I have seen on many occasions that these reviews just are not taking place. And it does say regular intervals, so you know, that's up to the organization to define. Obviously, I as an auditor, you know, if your regular interval is once every 3 years, I might have some further questions about that. See what kind of you know, turnover you have in staff or how frequently user access rights are being changed. It would be, I think, kind of a stretch to wait that long between reviews. But again, that's up to the organization to determine, but it does need to be taking place. And again, this kind of links with 922. These are going to help ensure that folks don't have access to things that they shouldn't or that they don't need to, because all that's going to do is increase the chance for something to happen that could result in a breach or worse. So lastly, the removal or adjustment of access rights. This is 8.9.2.6 in Annex A. And this states it is required that users' access is revoked upon termination or modified upon job change. I personally believe this is absolutely a critical control. And surprisingly, I have found in many cases that there's still active user accounts for terminated employees. So obviously there's going to be a huge risk associated with that. That's why it's paramount that you have a very well implemented, tightly controlled process when folks are off-boarded, whether it's voluntarily, involuntarily, whatever the case may be. Your systems team, your IT staff, whoever it may be, they need to be looped in and they need to be getting those accounts disabled immediately. Even if it's an amicable departure, you never know. An ex-employee might want to just see if they still have access to something, and it's not a good situation. You certainly don't want folks having access to your system after they've separated from the company. So that's another one that I've seen quite a bit of, and it's obviously something that we're going to take a close look at every time, just because of the risk that surrounds it. All right, the next section that I targeted in on for frequently written NCs was physical environmental security. And I'm sure this first one here, some of you probably struggle with this in your regular day-to-day work lives, depending on what your role is, but unattended user equipment. So the control is A11.2.8, and this control requires that unattended equipment have appropriate protection. What I've experienced is obviously this is going to be highly dependent on your staff and your users. A, understanding what the requirements are, and B, locking their computers when they get up, whether it's to grab something off the printer, to use the restroom, to get some coffee, to get some water, to just go talk to so-and-so real quick. It can be a tough habit to ingrain, but on the other side of that, I feel that once it has been ingrained into your staff, you know, I know personally I don't get up from my computer without hitting Windows L to lock it real quick. It's just, I don't even think about it anymore. But again, throughout the course of an audit, we're going to be walking around, talking to several different stakeholders, and we're going to have our eyes open. And if we're seeing unlocked screens, we're probably going to raise that as an NC. Obviously, there's risk associated with that, so it's very important. The other frequently written NC in this section of the controls is somewhat closely related, but it's clear desk and screen policy. So this is A.11.2.9. It requires that a clear desk and screen policy is adopted, and this includes printed materials and awareness of your surroundings if you deal with sensitive information. It also includes printed materials left on printers. It could be printed materials in garbage bins throughout the office that actually needed to be shredded. Again, this is one where auditors are going to have their eyes open as they walk around the facility throughout the course of the audit. And if there's papers that are face up on desks and unattended with personal information or sensitive information, there's a risk associated with that, and it's going to be an issue. But again, this is one that requires good training and awareness program for your staff so they understand what the expectations are, and probably some repeated reminders or reinforcements if you do see instances where folks aren't adhering to this. But again, this isn't something you can automate. We don't have a firewall or appliance or security mechanism that we can implement and forget. It's dependent on your people and your users. So certainly it's going to require some buy-in and probably some reminders. All right. This next one, so this is in the compliance section of the standard, and this is actually, there's only one control in here, but I did want to include it because it is one that I think, due to the way it is written and what the expectations are, it can be difficult. There's definitely going to be some due diligence to implement it, but I have written this a number of times, and we'll get into what the requirements are and what I see. So the first part of this control, A.18.1.1, requires that all legislative, statutory, regulatory, and contractual requirements concerning information security be documented and maintained. So obviously there's going to be some legwork there. You need to really understand, if things like GDPR or CCPA or HIPAA, et cetera, if these apply to you due to the information you handle and the sector of industry that you operate in. And the second half of this, which is where I see even more people stumble, is that it states the approach to meeting each requirement is documented. Again, as an auditor, my expectation is that for each of your identified requirements, maybe there's a reference to a procedure, maybe there's a reference to a particular training that you've administered to your staff. It could be any number of things, but there needs to be something there. The control is pretty cut and dry as far as what the expectations are. Both these things are expected to be documented and maintained. And to be quite frank and honest, there's many instances that I've audited an organization and they just simply didn't have the list or any documentation that would kind of match what this is saying. Or if they did identify what those requirements were, they didn't have anything documented to indicate how they're meeting those requirements. So I wanted to include this one just because this is certainly something that I see frequently. So I believe that's about the top 10 most frequently written NCs that I encounter during my auditing. At this time, I'd love to open the floor for questions. As Amy mentioned, I'd be happy to answer as many questions as you might have. So thank you for attending. I definitely appreciate you guys being interested in what we're doing here, and I hope you got some benefit out of this. And I will turn it over to Amy to field any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, it does look like we have some questions coming in. So like I said at the beginning, please don't hesitate. Just go ahead and drop your questions right in that questions tab. I am seeing that a few people came in late and must have missed our little announcement. Yes, we do record every webinar. The webinar recording will be available from our YouTube channel. You can either go to pgr.com and click the YouTube icon at the top of the homepage to go to our channel, or you can just search YouTube for Perry Johnson registrars, and it should be probably among the first couple of results. But without further ado, let me go ahead and look at these questions. It looks like we've got a couple of good ones from Kristen. Kristen asks, is certification to this ISO standard going to be acceptable for those who have been asked to comply with NIST SP 800-171 or CMMC levels?
Okay, great question, Kristen. So to start off with the NIST 800-171 requirement, so I cross-referenced the controls, and I believe ISO 27001 covers about 95% of the controls in NIST 800-171, depending on which revision you're looking at. But as far as, let's say, if you had a client or a customer or a government entity wanting to ensure that you were complied with NIST SP 800-171, I don't know for certain that they would take ISO 27001 in its place. They very well could, but there may be additional requirements on their end as far as a specific questionnaire or some attestation to NIST 800-171 itself. Now, as far as CMMC, this is something that we've obviously here been following very closely. So CMMC, for those who don't know, is a new requirement that is initially being rolled out at the end of this year, but it's going to eventually apply to all contractors working with the Department of Defense, and it is its own thing. They are currently developing the rules for becoming accredited certifying body to the standard. They are going to be handling all of the training for the assessors themselves. They'll be licensing the assessors out of their own accreditation body, but I can guarantee, 99% guarantee that an ISO 27001 certification won't equate to a CMMC. You'll still need to go through the CMMC process. What I will say is, based on my review of the CMMC standard, having ISO 27001 certification will mean that you've already implemented, again, probably 90% of what's required by CMMC level 3. So it would certainly put you in a better position, but I do not think it will take the place of going through the CMMC process itself. But thank you for the question. I hope that answered it for you.
Great. We've got another one from Kristen. What is the role/requirement of a risk owner?
So again, with the risk owner, what I'm expecting as an auditor is that it's somebody who has the technical expertise or knowledge to be able to understand the asset and the risks associated with it, as well as be able to make a decision on whatever the risk treatment proposed is. If you have a risk related to unencrypted connections to sensitive data, I wouldn't expect the risk owner to be the head of marketing who doesn't have any technical knowledge or understanding of what that might mean. It should be somebody in a position who can make a decision on what the risk treatment should be.
Okay, great. We've got another question from Bruce. Bruce asks, is there a guideline to do the risk assessment via a service-oriented approach?
Okay, and I see that Bruce has left here, so unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure what he's getting at with that question. I don't know if this is accurate or not, but Bruce, if you are still here, can you help me understand what a service-oriented approach is in comparison to a risk assessment? But unfortunately, with that information, I'm not quite sure how to answer it.
No worries. Mark does have a comment regarding the size of the font on the slides. Mark, if you're still here, the slides are available for download from our website. They should be up within the next 24 to 48 hours. So if you had a hard time reading any of the slides, you should be able to go to pgr.com and download them, and then you should, on your own screen, be able to zoom in or enlarge it. Okay, so we've got a question from Dominique. Dominique asks, is something like leaving equipment unattended a minor or a major NC, or is it just an observation?
Okay, good question, Dominique. So it's going to depend on the particular organization and the audit. If you're looking at an organization with, let's say, 100 people in the office, and over the course of the audit, we see one screen left unattended, or maybe even two, that would constitute a minor NC. I mean, it's still a nonconformity, but it doesn't indicate a major problem or a total lapse of the control. Now, if we were to see 30 to 40 unlocked screens over the course of an audit of a company of the same size, you're probably looking more towards a major there, because that would be more representative of a total breakdown, or just a failure of implementation of that particular control. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Trudy has a question regarding, do you have any sample questions that you might ask during recertification?
So Trudy, hi, how you doing? I believe Trudy is one of our certified organizations here that we audit for. But Trudy, during your recertification audit, you can expect that we're going to cover every aspect of the standard. So as during the last 2 surveillance audits, we took a sampling of controls from Annex A that we looked at. For the recert, we are going to look at everything. We're going to cover all the controls in Annex A, and obviously all the numbered clauses in the standard as well. So you can expect that we will ask all the questions. Hope that helps.
Definitely. We've got a couple of questions in the queue from, I'm sorry if I butchered this pronunciation, from YesScene. The first question that YesScene asks is, what risk methodology would you recommend for the risk assessment?
So YesScene, as an auditing body and as an auditor, I'm not allowed to recommend or consult in any way. But I will say I have done a presentation on risk assessment, and those slides are available on our website, and the video is available on YouTube. And that just takes you through one potential method. But again, it's really going to depend on your organization, the types of information that you deal with, and the sensitivity level. And of course, there's no shortage of resources regarding the different methods that you can implement. As an auditor, I don't have a preference for one or the other. As long as it's effectively managing your risks, that's all we're looking for.
Okay, great. We have 2 questions coming from Henry. Henry's first question is, would an example of regulatory compliance include OSHA security compliance, such as building security badges, lab entry requirements, etc.?
So OSHA's security compliance could certainly fall under information security. I think when you're talking about things like building security and badges, that ties directly in with physical security, which is a component of information security. So yeah, absolutely, that would be appropriate to include that.
Okay, great. Henry has a follow-up asking if you could share an example of a risk assessment that is well done. So that may be something then you would want to include in a future version of the slides, or?
Yeah, or I know in the risk assessment presentation that we have up on our website and on YouTube, I do kind of just have a example risk assessment. Actually, that might be a statement of applicability. Let me back up on it. Yes, you know what, Amy, I think that would be an excellent addition for a future presentation, but I don't have one I could send to you, Henry, right now. I apologize.
All right. Going back to YesScene, YesScene asks, based on your experience, do you have any examples of procedures, policy, et cetera, to guide through ISO 27001 implementation?
Again, this is going to be difficult because I can't give specific guidance. And I can't even think of something that would be brief enough that I could answer in this forum right now. Yeah, that's a tough one, yes. I don't have anything off the top of my head as far as an example of like an exemplary procedure or policy. You know, other than stating the obvious, which is obviously make sure it meets the requirements of what the standard is calling for in that given control or policy. The standard does explicitly call out a lot of what it's expecting you to implement and adopt, but I don't have anything off the top of my head as far as an example, procedure, or policy.
All right, we got YesScene asking all the tough questions today. We
Yeah.
have a question now coming from Diana. Diana asks, should the review of user access rights be completed, or I'm sorry, be documented as completed and therefore maintained for review by auditor? In other words, just saying it was done will not comply.
Yes, definitely. You're going to want to document and retain those records. Unfortunately, it's something I refer to as the burden of being certified. As an auditor, we have to be able to verify that you're doing what you've said you've done. And whether it's some kind of spreadsheet or there's an email trail, there just needs to be some evidence that, this is the review, this is how we did it, these were the results of the review. But yes, you are going to be able to, the auditor is going to be able to need to verify that it was done, looking at some evidence.
All right, and then another question from Dominique. As an auditor, how do you determine when something is a major versus a minor NC, or an observation, or an opportunity for improvement, et cetera?
So as the auditor, it's our job, obviously, to make that classification. And what we're basically looking at are a couple of things. Number one, is it something that we're seeing multiple instances of? If it's a single instance of something not being fulfilled, most likely it's going to be a minor. If you start seeing multiple instances of the same issue in different areas or amongst different people happening, then what you need to look at is what the risk that it poses is to the information security of the organization. So that's the two sets of criteria. So in other words, it could be something that doesn't seem to pose a big risk in and of itself, but because you're seeing, let's say for instance, you catch someone holding open a locked door for somebody that you're supposed to badge into. Well, if you see that once, that's probably a minor. But if I'm seeing 20 or 30 people, let me or strangers in, just being polite, whatever the case may be, that might represent a more major nonconformity because there's a lot bigger risk there. Or it could be something that you only see one instance of, but it's such a glaring risk that it has to be made a major. Like, I don't know, just as a crazy example, your company exposes a database publicly so that people remotely can get to it of sensitive information, and there's no authentication. There's no password needed. There's no username needed. Something like that. Obviously, it sounds far-fetched, but that would probably be a major nonconformity.
Okay, great. Going back to Kristen. Kristen has a question. How many of the 27,000 series standards are included in a certification?
So for us, 27,001 is the standard that we're certifying against. So that's what your certificate will say, is that you're certified to ISO 27001. When you look at standards like ISO 27002 and 3, those are guidance standards, and those are great resources if you're looking to implement a system to help you understand what's expected and how to best go about implementing. If there's a standard that explains in further detail what the numbered requirements mean in the clauses, there's also guidance on all the controls in Annex A. So those are great resources if you're looking to implement. There's a standard 27,006. That's the requirements for us or any certification body who's certifying to the standard. That's everything we need to do on our end as far as choosing auditors, conducting audits, maintaining records, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as what we're actually auditing you against, it's ISO 27001.
All right, great. Beth has a question. She's looking for a good place to find regulatory compliance organizations to stay up to date with.
Beth, Google's your best friend. I can't give the specific website out, but I know I found a great site that has state-by-state information security regulations. And I was able to find it just with a couple quick Google searches. I think information security regulation Compliance might get you there, but there's a lot of resources out there that are freely available. It shouldn't be too difficult to find.
All right. If anyone has any more questions, please drop them in because we're getting down to the bottom of the barrel, so to say. We've got it looks like about the same question from both Henry and YesScene. They are inquiring regarding examples of KPIs that might be adopted.
Examples of internal ongoing KPIs and rewards program to reinforce positive behavior. Well, I can say something I commonly see will be organizations who launch phishing campaigns internally. So basically they're sending out phishing emails, which aren't really phishing emails, like nothing bad's gonna happen, but they're tracking how many people are clicking on these. And certainly you could implement some type of reward-based feedback loop on that for folks if you see, a certain percentage of people did the right thing and reported it versus clicked on it, etc. But yeah, again, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything to point you to as far as examples of internal ongoing KPIs. So I apologize, Henry.
All right, question from Ed. With the current coronavirus situation, how can we do an effective audit?
So Ed, what we're doing right now in these obviously unprecedented times is wherever possible, we're doing audits virtually. So we're using tools like GoToMeeting, screen sharing, video and audio conferencing, obviously, to conduct the audit. And honestly, for ISO 27001, we found that almost all of the standard does lend itself to being audited remotely. Obviously, there's certain sections in physical security that we can't effectively audit. But the idea is that we're still going ahead and conducting the audits, and as soon, at the next audit that we're available or that we're allowed to go on site, we're obviously going to follow up on those areas that we weren't able to look at due to the situation. But with screen sharing and most people not using paper records anymore, most things aren't handwritten. Most records and documents are going to be available electronically to review. Obviously, if we're confirming system configurations or looking at logs or any number of electronic records in that manner, that lends itself to the virtual audit process. So for the most part, we're able to look at everything.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to mention there is an upcoming session. It's next week, Thursday, April 23rd at 11, so the same time that this webinar ran, but a week from today. We do have an upcoming webinar regarding PJR's virtual auditing process, and that's with Joe Krolikowski. So if you do go to our website at pjr.com and go to the training tab at the top, it should drop down with webinars towards the bottom of that menu. And if you click, you'll have the full list of all of our upcoming webinars. You should be able to easily register for that virtual auditing webinar. All right, and we have one more question from Bruce. Bruce asks, what are the roles of risk management team and document team? For example, documenting drills.
What are the roles of risk management team? I'm sorry, Bruce, can you provide any more detail? I don't think I'm quite understanding the question based on that.
All right, while Bruce adds some detail possibly, Trudy has one more question. For remote audits, what are the expectations when it comes to the process owner's physical locations?
So if I'm understanding this correctly, as far as the physical location, so things in the standard that are directly related to the physical locations, like physical security, we're not going to be able to look at them during the remote audit, and that's just something that we've accepted, and obviously there's nothing we can do about it with nobody being. Okay, there it is. Does anybody need to be on site? In other words, so Trudy, no. As long as you're able to access the records and information that we need remotely, there's no need for someone to be physically on site. If somebody can be physically on site and it's safe to be physically on site, that would help us in terms of we could then look at using some video conferencing and maybe have somebody walk around with their smartphone and allow us to do a physical inspection, ensure doors are locked, things are under lock and key, things of that nature. But if you can't be there, we're not going, obviously, to force you to be there or to be unsafe in order to conduct a remote audit. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, looks like that answered Trudy's question. One more from YesScene, looking for suggested tools or solutions for data classification.
Again, YesScene, I wish I could give you some specific recommendations. I don't, because I'm auditing it, I haven't had to implement it. I haven't looked for tools. I would imagine that there's got to be tools out there. I know there's all sorts of GRC tools. I don't know exactly how they handle data classification, but obviously, as far as solutions for data classification, it's really going to come down to what types of information you handle and what the different requirements for handling it are. And then you need to break those out into categories, assign them names, and then come up with what the handling requirements are, the retention requirements, how you get rid of them, how it's safe to transfer them, things of that nature. That would be about as much specific advice as I could give.
All right, it does look like Henry has a suggestion for YesScene using LinkedIn to get suggestions, so that may be something worth looking into. If there are, Bruce has provided further elaboration on his question regarding the roles of risk management and document teams. He says, who's responsible to document and validate the drills?
Okay, and then I just want to scroll back up to his previous question so I can put it all together. Bruce. Okay, so as far as who's responsible to document and validate drills, and when you say drills, Bruce, sorry to ask again, are you talking about like tabletop exercises or drills of disaster recovery, or what exact type of drills are you talking about? See if he responds here. Give him a minute. Well, while I'm waiting, I can say in general, it's up to the organization, Bruce, to determine who's responsible to document. Okay, disaster recovery. So yeah, as far as who's responsible, that's completely up to the organization. Now, obviously, you'd like to see someone different. If someone's creating the DR drill, you'd like to see it validated by somebody else. Obviously, we don't want just one person sitting down writing out both sides of the equation on that. But it's completely up to the organization as far as whom they want to make responsible for each of those tasks. Yes, I hope that helps. I guess let me know if that answered your question or not, Bruce.
All right. If there's anybody else with questions, John's contact information as well as the main line at PJR is up on the screen at the moment. So if you want to take note of that, if you had other specific questions or, more specific scenarios that you don't necessarily want discussed on the air, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. We're happy to take questions, comments, anything. But with that, I just want to remind everyone, yes, the slides will be available from our website. The recording will be on our YouTube channel, and we will hopefully see everyone in the next webinar. John, any closing remarks?
No, just Amy, thank you, and thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much for all the questions. I love to see the questions. I love to try and help out as much as I can, so thanks for the participation, guys. This was great, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.
All right, thanks everybody for your time attending. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.